Okay, well, let everyone will straggle in whenever. Um, First off, I guess, are there any questions or comments or other things? I don't see anyone jumping up and down on that one. Okay. Let's see. Let's switch on to this actually. Okay. Excuse me. All the populations we're looking at from now on, for well, just what last week and a day, are going to be post World War II. So they're post 1950. And there's several things that are really key about that. The really important one is the plantations are gone. The plantations pretty much disappeared by the 1920s. Even though the Filipinos are still arriving, by the mid-late 1920s, the plantations have quit hiring. As I mentioned, I think last week, the plantations by the 20s or late 20s are entirely mechanized. They need skilled, very technical workforces. So the day of the sort of bulk one human powered machine on the sugar plantation or pineapple plantation is pretty much gone. Pineapple keeps workers, but even by then, by the late 1930s, what they're generally doing is, for example, here, and it was common right into I think the 50s or 60s, they recruit high school students. So they recruit kids in the local population and making it into sort of like a summer adventure type thing. So the plantations by the 1930s aren't hiring anymore. And so that means that original huge reason for the local development of the local population, all this mix of people we see here, is gone. That engine has disappeared. So one is the engine has disappeared. Secondly, and probably equally important, is not only has that engine disappeared, but most importantly, even though the plantations didn't intend it that way, the structure of the plantations was such that if you were on the plantation, since they didn't care, as far as they were concerned, everyone was a one human powered machine. They didn't care if you were Japanese or Chinese or Okinawan or whatever. So in that situation, the plantations were basically the school. The plantations were where people learned how to survive over here. They learned what sort of the rules were over here. And by the early 20th century, when the sort of definition of local was starting to sort of take place, they learned Pidgin. They learned the plantation Creole that became our common language here. So in that context, the plantations were really critical because they were the place in which people learned how to assimilate. And because the plantation didn't care and the plantation gave them no choice, it was really efficient. People won't assimilate if they have choice. People would dearly love to perpetually be sort of on the outside looking in, knowing just enough to get by, but not having to give up anything they're comfortable with. And this is why militaries have boot camps. Boot camps are a classic example of forced assimilation, and they're very, very good at it. They've been using them for over 3,000 years, and they work. To a certain extent, the plantation was like a boot camp. It forced everyone, regardless of their desire, to assimilate. And that meant that, Japanese had to learn how to get along with Okinawans and Koreans, which they disliked intensely. Filipinos who were from, say, Ilocos Norte province had to learn how to get along with Japanese and other groups that they'd never met before. Chinese had to learn to get along with everyone who they'd never met before. So in this context, the plantation was really critical because it forced everyone to accept each other. And it did it basically on a 24/7, 365 scenario because everyone was in barracks together. So very much like a boot camp, it worked in exactly the same way. By the time these groups come after World War II, that's all gone. The plantations are gone, in many cases, in most cases, actually gone. The work system is not that way. And so what it means, if you're Samoan and you come over, say, in 1968, and you move to, we'll say, stereotypically you end up in Laie, you don't have any of that process of forced assimilation. You can pick and choose how much you want to assimilate, or you can try not to assimilate at all, but you don't have anyone making you do it. And what that means is when you're looking at all the groups that come out here after World War II, one of the big issues you notice with them is they have a very hard time being accepted by the local population. And one of the reasons for that is simply the fact that they don't undergo that assimilation process. They don't go through boot camp, if you want to. And therefore, it's harder to get legitimized here. And also, there's a strong and pretty accurate representation from the local population that these groups don't want to adapt and adjust to life here in the same way that the other groups had to. If you don't have to do what we had to do, why should we respect you type thing? And so the fact that it becomes selective choice and much more sort of, ambiguous makes life very different for these groups. And that's one reason why they end up with probably even more stereotypes. So it's a little bit tricky than the groups before, but the stereotypes stick longer. They have a longer period of time before they get sort of folded into the concept of local. Samoans are the most recent group, which has sort of moved from heavily stereotyped even 20 years ago to a group which is pretty much sort of folded into the system. Having said that, if you're on Maui, for example, where it's got a large Tongan population, Tongans legitimately are pretty PO'd because, you know, I don't think almost anyone here realizes there's actually a large population of Tongans here. They just think they're Samoans, which is totally wrong. But that's a group that hasn't, for one reason or another, really become visible. And you know, I'm not sure what's behind that. To be honest, I haven't ever studied it. The more recent groups are Southeast Asians. Again, Micronesians they're more recent to a certain extent, but also they don't have this need to adapt. And because they haven't been forced to adapt, they stick out more. The more you stick out, the more you're going to get stereotyped. So one of the side effects of all these changes with these post-World War II groups is new groups coming in here tend to go through a process that looks a lot more like what you see, for example, in the US mainland or in the rest of the world than what you saw pre-World War II, which is where the plantations were the great sort of training ground or school, you know, sort of cultural school for survival skills. And without that, nothing's taken its place. And so the groups that have come over here, especially since the 70s and 80s, are really having a hard time. And the local population isn't particularly willing to bend cut them a lot of slack, because in the local context, everyone had to give up a lot to be a part of the system here. And they don't see the new groups as being willing to sort of, you know, pony up to the table the same way. And to be honest, none of those groups that did it before during the plantation period would have if they had a choice. And the groups here now, of course, have a choice. So that makes the process both of who they are and what they are, and how they adjust or adapt to being part of the system here, much more problematic than it was in you know, say 100 years ago, where it was brutal but straightforward. Which sometimes brutal is usually bad, but sometimes brutal, if you really want to get something done in a hurry, is sort of like, you know, it's the big hammer approach, and sometimes it works. So the first of these groups I want to look at is Polynesians. So this would be largely Samoans and Tongans. There's some Fijians here, but they're not really a visible group here in Hawaii. So Samoans and Tongans are your two main populations here. And again, as with the other groups, we have to go back in time. Samoa here, Tonga here. These two island groups are part of much earlier Polynesia. So they're part of the Polynesian first settlement wave, moving out of basically Melanesia, New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, moving into this area, Fiji, and then settling in this part of the Central Pacific. From here, your sort of second wave of migration was out to, for example, the Tahiti, the society group out here, the Cook and Austral Islands, etc. The last wave of migration is, of course, the migration that moves from here up to Hawaii, and roughly about the same period, slightly later, moves down to New Zealand down this way, and also, you know, Rapa Nui or Easter Island in the other direction. So Samoa and Tonga are part of an earlier, sort of the initial wave of Polynesian settlement or Polynesian development in the Pacific. So they're very much part of an older system of doing things. They also, unlike the eastern areas, like say Tahiti, that area, they don't go through a huge amount of change. They go through, at least in the pre-European period, they stay fairly conservatively in the traditional system as far as we can tell. We know this just by virtue of linguistics and stuff, in terms of, like, you know, terms for kinship, stuff like that tend to be fairly consistent. They don't seem to have changed a lot. As I think I mentioned sort of in passing, the Pa'au religious movement that starts up over here in Eastern Polynesia moves into this area. Central Polynesia gets thrown back out again real quickly. So unlike the Eastern area, the central population was much more aggressive about keeping to its traditional patterns of behavior and not accepting this new religion and the new sort of social, you know, cultural hierarchical mandate that the new religion was pushing, which becomes, of course, the Pa'au movement up here in Hawaii. So this is part of an older system. And if you remember back in the beginning of the semester, I pointed out that if you look at traditional Hawaiian society at the time of arrival and settlement here, it is very similar to what you still see in Samoa and Tonga. And what you did see, and in fact still have big chunks of in places like Tahiti, versus the system that was in place when, say, Cook arrives in 1778, which is very much the second, you know, sort of cultural modification from this new religion and the social context of it. So these guys are basically staying in the old ways, if you want to think of it that way, to a certain extent. Now this all radically changes, of course, and one of the things to notice here is the absolute distance you're talking about. When people talk about Polynesia, I think there's sort of a perception that everything's sort of close. That ain't the case, folks. You're talking a really long distance. Samoa, Tonga are much closer to New Zealand, and even Australia than they are Hawaii. So, they're not part of sort of like contiguous areas. They just share the same cultural pattern. And of course, if you go back in the literature, you find that this is what fascinated folks like Cook, was the fact that you had this population scattered over literally, tens of thousands of miles if you add up the total distances. And yet they all shared a fairly common, consistent cultural pattern. They spoke very similar dialectic versions of similar languages. They're obviously part of the same package. But how they ended up scattered across the world's largest ocean was a huge puzzle. Right into the late 20th century, which is one reason why Bishop Museum is what it is. Its original intention was to basically figure out the puzzle of, one, of Hawaii, who Hawaiians were, and two, of Polynesian settlement. Though they pretty much passed on that one now, I guess. Anyways, so this is this part of the world. Now, several things are really key about this, not the least of which again is almost no play here, because in Hawaii, our history of the rest of the Pacific that we teach in schools is somewhere way south of lame. And especially, I think, on the Pacific. I'm not sure they teach anything in the schools about the Pacific. What you have to remember here is these parts of the Pacific down here get discovered by Europeans a lot earlier. Tonga, especially, the Spanish discovered Tonga. They don't know what to do with it, but they actually map it, and they're actually there. And there's some little evidence that they have to actually left one or two diseases, I can't remember what they were, they can sort of trace genetically, that show up from that moment on. So the islands down here, as with much of the rest of the central Polynesia, the central Pacific, were located and identified and already had Europeans visiting for at least 150, 200 years in advance of Hawaii ever being located. And one of the reasons for that huge gap is just because Hawaii is completely off the chart. If you're sailing this way, you're going to see land all the time. The idea of turning right and going 2,500 miles this way, people are going to be thinking, why would you do that? So in that context, this area of the Pacific gets located very, very early, relatively speaking. They have European contacts very, very early. And these places, of course, as a result of that, get colonized very, very early, relatively speaking. The Dutch come through here, the British come through, the French come through, all the normal players in the Pacific come through this region. And for much of this area, especially Samoa, they compete. They compete for who's going to have control. The French acquire fairly early after sort of throwing the British out. The French acquire what's now French Polynesia, and still are French territories, by the way. The British acquire and colonize, or I should say, make Cook Australs into one of their colonies. The British do the same thing with Fiji and most of this area here. The French take New Caledonia, Nouvelle Calédonie, and make that one of theirs. The two split and make what they call the New Hebrides, a codominium, which is the British and French both ruling the place. Which, if you ever want to get into political stupidness, is probably one of the best examples of how dumb politicians can be. Would be the management of this part of the Pacific. So in that context, what happens is when they get into this area, two things sort of intervene. One is, by the time that they're trying to figure out whose flag is going to fly in this area, one of the problems they've got is very simply that in that context, they've already come up with this idea of Polynesians as being a version of European. So they see Polynesians as being, again, remember this missing tribe from Israel, or whatever you want to call it. So you can't treat Polynesians like you do the folks over here, where you just colonize them, stick up the flag, and tell them salute it, and then arrest them if they don't want to. Here you're supposed to take care of these people. So you sort of have to visualize their view of Polynesians as sort of like an endangered species. So they sort of become like a version of Nature Conservancy. And that's how they see their role in this part of the Pacific. So in that context, what they want to do is both make sure these groups sort of continue, but of course get civilized. They have to become Christian. They can't go around whacking each other anymore. But on the other hand, you want them to keep as much of what you think, as the European stereotypes are, of that innocence that made them closer to the Garden of Eden than the Europeans who are colonizing the place. So in that concept, there's this weird sort of huge amount of sort of big brother protectorship view of this area. This most unfortunately lays on Tonga, which gets stuck with a British protectorate. And basically right down till, the 1970s, the British basically see Tonga as it's a colony, but it's not. So they actually make one of the Tongan high chiefs, the Tongatapu, and they make him basically into a king, which is not what the traditional system was. And so what they do is they try to, in their view, in the British view, they try to stabilize Tongan society, but at the same time, they think they're trying to sort of fossilize it, so it'll remain the way it was when they saw it. But of course, they're twinking with it all the time. You throw Christianity, all this other stuff in, it's not the same. But the British attitude was sort of like a hobby, so it's something they could do, and they had the power to make it stick. So they set up this place as this weird sort of kingdom protectorate. Samoa, the British, the Americans, and the Germans actually go at it. The British first throw their missionaries into Samoa. The French throw some missionaries in, get them thrown back out again. The British London Missionary Society, especially once it gets thrown out of French Polynesia, sets up shop here. In fact, just as a note, for the next 100 years, in fact, still actually today, they still use Tongans as LMS missionaries in a lot of the rest of the Pacific. So rather than send missionaries from England out into the rest of the Pacific, what they do is they train Tongans as missionaries and then send them out in the Pacific, which is what you actually see in your Pacific Island histories from the 1830s, 1840s on, is Tongan missionaries who are trained by the Brits. And so in that context, they try to set up shop here. The Americans, for what reasons I've never quite figured out, get involved. The Hawaiian government gets involved. The Hawaiian government Kalakaua sends a ship down and does a mutual defense, PR treaty with Samoa. The Germans get involved, and I don't even remember, good luck figuring that one out. But anyways, the Germans get up with their feet in the whole mess. And you almost end up with a three-sided war. I think it was in Apia Harbor, I forget. But all of a sudden in the 1870s, you actually end with three navies, the American, the British, and the German Navy, all getting ready to fire on each other because each missionary group that's tied to a country has gotten backing of various Samoan chiefs, and they're starting to whack each other at the instigation of the missionaries. So the German missionaries are trying to get the Samoan chiefs to whack the Brits and their Samoan converts, and the American missionaries are trying to get the Samoan chiefs under their sway to whack the British and the Germans. So you got this three-ring circus going on. And it's one of those sort of ironic aspects of global history that in the middle of all this mess, they've got warships with guns aimed at each other, literally ready to open fire to sort this mess out. So you got three militaries in here to protect their missionaries. And all of a sudden a hurricane hits and just wipes the whole thing out. I think the Germans lose all but one ship. The Americans lose all their ships. The British lose a couple of ships. And the end result is you got like 5 or 6 ships sunk because of a hurricane, and all of a sudden it's like everyone just got slapped up the side of the head. Everyone's going like, wait, we were going to start World War I over what? And the end result is when the dust finally settles, part of Samoa becomes German and taken over by the Brits, and the eastern part ends up under sort of vague American control, and you end up with 2 Samoas, which is still what you've got today, with American Samoa being a colony. The British part becomes an independent country in the 1960s, I think it is. So these places have their own very, very strange history. It has absolutely nothing to do with us. In fact, there's no interest, for the folks in this part of the world, there's absolutely no interest in us. Samoa and Tonga, because they're tied to the British system. By the late 19th, early 20th century, the British aren't actually directly managing these spots as they do in a lot of the Pacific. They dump it on their colonies. Australia was pretty much tagged with managing the British colonies in Melanesia. New Zealand gets tagged with managing the British colonies in Polynesia. The Cooks, Tonga, Samoa, all end up sort of under New Zealand protectorship. So New Zealand becomes the new big brother instead of the Brits, who now become like grandpa. And so that's still the way it is now. These are independent countries now, but they still get huge amounts of foreign aid from New Zealand. If you're going to get an advanced education, you go to New Zealand. My counterpart, the other anthropologist that teaches this class, he teaches out of Massey University in New Zealand, and a fair amount of his student population is actually from Samoa and Tonga. So, even today, New Zealand is who they're interested in. That's where the money is. That's where the power is. That's where it's at. So they're really not interested in the United States. American Samoa is, but to be honest, American Samoa's relationship with the United States is even more equivocal than Guam's. America's never been a huge effective manager of colonial property, and American Samoa could be almost used as a poster child for how to mismanage it, something you call a colony or a territory. So in that context, what happens is their world is pretty much here. Their world revolves around Australia and New Zealand, economically, politically, socially, and every which way. The two Samoas are technically split, though when they got split into one group and the other, there's no distinction. Families lived on both areas. Ferries go back and forth even today. So, you know, the two Samoas was an artificial European-American construct. It bore no relationship to any sort of reality. It was something just laid on Samoans. So this area basically has no interest in Hawaii. It has no interest in the Americas, to be honest. Their entire focus is to their southwest. Okay, all this radically changes in World War II. World War II starts up. The Europeans/Americans lose all of Melanesia with the exception of a few islands in the Solomons. Almost all of Micronesia, of course, already belonged to the Japanese prior to World War II. World War II starts up and the United States loses Guam, which is pretty much its only possession. So pretty much this whole chunk of the world now belongs to the Japanese. And so, you know, by 1942, the Americans, Australians, New Zealanders all started thinking, well, we got to do something about that, especially because the Japanese were planning to invade Australia, because of course they're quite close to it. So in that context, what you had to do is you had to set up these large military bases, sort of like baby versions of Pearl Harbor, for the purpose of projecting military force into the Pacific to reconquer it, take it back from the Japanese. So in that concept, what happens is all of a sudden Samoa becomes a real interesting place because, you know, Pongo Pongo is a good harbor, and Apia has a pretty decent harbor. And so in that context, what you get is all of a sudden the Samoan island group becomes absolutely central to the World War II, at least in the early stages. Now, because of the distance that was involved, you know, and the fact that both New Zealand and Australia really didn't have a big production base, so they really couldn't help out with a lot of stuff. And what that means is very quickly, if you wanted something, it comes from the United States, and it comes to the United States through Hawaii and then down here. So very quickly, the United States starts building up its military resources in this part of the world, especially Samoa. Tonga, they really didn't see much value to militarily. But in Samoa, they start building large military bases. Ironically, then they almost get them just barely half done. And at that point, they start re-invading in the Pacific, both in the Kiribati and also in Vanuatu, and especially the Solomons. And in that context, they don't need the bases. So they basically spend about a year trying to build up Samoa into a major set of military installations. And almost before the paint's dried, they pretty much take up everything, lock, stock, and barrel, and move it about 1,500 miles to the west to start all over again, which is sort of the history of the Pacific War, which is literally, you know, islands get invaded every couple of months. You build up huge new military bases. And in most cases, within a year, you completely abandon them because you've moved to a new spot and you start all over again. So by 1944, this part of the Pacific, Samoa and Tonga, was a backwater again, and pretty much disappears from U.S. interest. Of course, it's still, the eastern part is still a U.S. colony, but at that point, the United States is not interested in investing any money in the place, not that it ever did. So that's the situation post-World War II. In this context, two things happen. One is, and I don't know, you'd have to ask someone who's part of the LDS. I don't know what their relationship is. Church of Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, yeah, I think that's it, gets involved in Polynesia early on, both in terms of sending missions out to Polynesia, but also recruiting Polynesians back to Utah specifically. Initially, there's actually a fairly large number of Hawaiians that end up in Utah. In fact, there's still a community of Hawaiians that date back to I think the first arrival was 1880 something, back in the Kalakaua period, because you remember there was that guy, Gibson, that was actually a Mormon that comes out here into Hawaii. So there's a fairly close relationship between the Kalakaua family, or the political structure of the Hawaiian monarchy in its later period, and the Utah Church of Latter-day Saints, which never really got particularly going because, not surprisingly, given the huge power of the Calvinist, you know, missionary boy plantation population here, there was no way they were going to let that happen. So what happens is part of the Mormon theology has something to do, and again, it's been years since I've looked at this, has something to do with the fact that Polynesians are actually integrated somewhere in the theology as part of the historic process of the development of you know, basically religious history for the LDS. Now, it's not true of the rest of the folks in the Pacific. It's a Polynesia thing. So the church, the LDS sees its missions in Polynesia as being really central to its basic definition of who it is. The church, the LDS and the rest of the Pacific, they're fairly active, are just missions like they would have anywhere else in the world, but not in Polynesia. Polynesians are considered special. So in that context, they spent a lot of time and effort both missionizing Polynesia, especially in the central Polynesian area. And they're actually, pretty successful at it because they're, in some ways, they're much more attractive than, say, the Anglican London Missionary Society group, or else the Calvinists from here, who are, pretty intolerant and don't really offer as much in some ways. So the Mormons make inroads. They start basically moving populations from largely Samoa, though some Tongans. Recruiting them to basically set up communities here in Hawaii, the most famous being Laie, but also, of course, Lanai, and some other spots. And this is going on sort of, in like literally families, 2 people, 5 people, whatever, through the sort of early 20th century. 1950, what happens is another big bang. The U.S. the military decides to close down its naval base at Pongo Pongo. They had, again, a fairly large facility, but it was pretty much just vegging out. And for some reason, the base commander, and I'm not sure what this was about, decided that since the Tongan population had been so loyal during the war, and tons of Tongans, I should say Samoan population had been so loyal during the war, and tons of Samoans volunteered in World War II and formed their own units actually in the Pacific. So in that context, the American commander actually petitioned, I guess, whoever was running the Pearl Harbor facilities, the admiral in charge of this part of the Pacific, and asked if he could actually recruit the skilled workforce in Samoa that was already working on the area there to just bring their families up and basically migrate to Hawaii to work at the Pearl facilities, the Pearl Harbor Naval Station. And for some reason they say, yeah. And so what happens is basically the U.S. Navy migrates, I believe it's somewhere between 100 and 200, I forget the exact numbers, folks up here in the early 1950s as they're shutting the facility down here so they can sort of keep their jobs and move to Hawaii. And this becomes the first big migration of folks from central Polynesia to Hawaii. It's instigated entirely by the U.S. Navy. And again, it's tapping very specifically a skilled workforce that's already part of the workforce in another part of the world. These folks come up, you've of course got this slow stream of folks coming up for the Mormon church. And the end result of both of these, that you end up with sort of this link then of what we call chain migration, where the folks up here are then asked, oh, can you take some more relatives? And then folks come up here and stay with them and then set up shop and then sort of spill out into this thing. So this is a very different wave of migration. There's no business entities in Hawaii that are trying to find cheap labor. There's no aspect of the Hawaiian economy that goes down to this area to recruit anyone. These folks are coming over as families. Once the Navy recruits that first group, the Navy doesn't hire anyone else. So, no, that sort of stops. It's like one bang. So what you have here is family-driven, network-driven migration to Hawaii. And the key thing to remember here is this population, because the American, sad to say, disinterest in American Samoa, and to a lesser extent, the British New Zealand disinterest in Samoa and Tonga, means that these folks are not well educated even by Hawaii standards when they come up here. Most of this population has, estimates right into the 1980s where the Samoans coming up here and the Tongans coming up here basically had the equivalent of about a 3rd or 4th grade education, just because the educational systems were not particularly strong in their home areas. So they come up over here, and that way they're actually very similar to the groups that came over earlier. They're coming over here without a particularly good education. They have no particularly useful job skills. They have nothing that would technologically allow them to function effectively in Hawaii. You have to remember, among other things, you have almost no road system in these islands. So, you have a population, if you watch that Fires Burning video, you have a population which hasn't even experienced, for example, traffic. And in some cases, they've only seen maybe 1 or 2 traffic lights in their life. So they're coming very much from a rural Polynesian background. And so when they hit here, it's literally the big city, and I don't care what island it is, they're all the big city compared to the area they're coming from. And again, they don't have the skill sets, but the huge difference they've got is post-World War II, there's not a lot of jobs lying around here for people with very limited skill sets. And of course, on top of that, in the post-World War II, especially World War II world, especially by the 60s and 70s, you've got a large population here of a local population who are, even if they're Filipino, they're second or third generation. And all these folks are competing for jobs in the Hawaiian Islands. There's no job labor vacuum that these folks coming up from Polynesia can fill that no one else wants. Everyone up here, the standard of living, the cost of living is already incredibly high. Everyone here is trying to work the minimum, as we all do, at least 2 jobs. And so in that context, there's no room for a group of low skill workforce. There's just no place for them. Any job they take is rather stereotypically seen as a job taken from a local person, which of course is the same problem that all the groups here had when they tried to migrate to the mainland in the 19th and 20th century. If you're Chinese and you go to the US mainland, say California in 1886, they legitimately see you as trying to take a job from one of them because they want those jobs. So in the same way that folks here had got hammered on when they went to the mainland, the folks from Polynesia, when they come to Hawaii, find that there's absolutely no love lost with folks here about inviting them in. It's like, dude, what are you doing here? If you get a job, that's a job I don't have or my cousin doesn't get. So they're the first group that smacks into this, fact that the world here has changed radically. And there are no free job openings, especially for low skilled workforce. Again, because it's post-World War II, this group has not assimilated. They have not learned Pidgin, for example, Creole. They haven't learned the appropriate forms of dress or even movement or something like that you find typically here, which means they just stand out like a sore thumb. And because they don't have a particular skill set that makes them invaluable here, you don't see them providing a service that makes them acceptable. And if you think of the contrast, for example, to the Okinawans. Okinawans come up in the 1910-20 period, and they come over here and they stay on the farms. And very quickly, everyone needs Okinawans because they're useful farmers, truck farming. They're the ones raising the really good pigs. They just make a niche for themselves, and no one else particularly wants that. So that they very quickly get accepted into the local community, even by groups like the Japanese that don't like them, simply because they're real useful and they're doing something that everyone else wants, but no one else wants to do. In other words, they're providing a very useful specialized service. When these folks are coming up from Samoa and Tonga, there's none of that. There's no place that they're wanted. There's no place they're needed. And this means that they're just really caught in a hard situation. Now, of course, what you also get along with this is, again, very much part of what we saw with the earlier groups, but this is exacerbated by the fact that telecommunications and stuff has gotten so much better by the 1950s. Of course, with these groups, really, we're talking the 60s and 70s. And what you find is, because these folks have access to TV and such like that, is their stereotype of the wealth of the United States and their stereotype of the wealth of Hawaii is completely off the charts. These folks have, even today, in many cases, have incredibly naive views of what life is like in Hawaii in terms of just basically there's money lying on the street and you just basically land and you got 2 jobs. And just this totally erroneous assumption that wealth and prosperity and success is easily available in Hawaii if you just make a little effort. The closest parallel to this would be that second group of Koreans that comes over, post 1970s, that also has these very distorted views of here. The huge difference with this group is, like the Filipinos in the 20th century, a lot of the population of their families does not migrate here. So what you get is this becomes the first of the true remittance economies. Very early on, the families in Samoa and Tonga, and especially the heads of families, the matai, the senior members of families, the senior family cluster, stays home. They don't come up here in most cases. They send other families members up here, and these members send money back home. So you basically are exporting part of your kin, part of your family group, and that becomes your production base. They become the money generators that send the money back for the consumers down here in the Central Islands. And this becomes the sort of model that you see that's still very much part of this world in 2020. Samoans and Tongans in Hawaii are expected to labor for a large number of family in Samoa or Tonga. And a large part of what they make goes back to these home areas. And they're under very constant reminders that the family is dependent upon their resources and they owe the family. This is one of the huge pressures you see with the populations up here. They do not have the luxury of isolation. If you're Chinese or Japanese, the other groups, yeah, you can send money back home. But in the 19th century, that was by letter. There's 6 months or a year in between if you're lucky. A lot of times it's pretty iffy. So whether you wanted to or not, you pretty much had to figure out how to stand on your own, but you also had, more of your own resources to spend. With this population, that's not true. By the 1960s, 70s, it only takes a couple of minutes to send money from Hawaii to Samoa or Tonga. So, it only takes a phone call away, even when it's landlines. So you don't have that distance doesn't mean anything. And what it means is this population up here, because of those stereotypes of the wealth of this place, means that you send folks up here that are not at all prepared to survive in Hawaii. That really know not very much about the place. That are initially, when they arrive here, depending on relatives who have already arrived and sort of figured out how to survive here to help them out. But immediately from the minute they land, there's family back home saying, send us money, send us money. So these folks are under an enormous amount of pressure to produce for family in the home area. And this becomes a real big problem for them, is this distance, the issue of distance, but the fact that distance isn't what it was, sort of back in the day, if you want to think of it that way. So this idea of remittance economies, we're going to see this with the other groups too. This is, to a lesser extent, this isn't quite as true of Southeast Asians, because till recently Southeast Asians were largely refugees. But when you're looking at Micronesians are in exactly the same. In fact, for some reason or another, they're just taking exactly the same model. A large part of the Micronesian population here is under, basically huge amounts of pressure to send resources back to their home. So you intentionally tag parts of the family to come over here. Now, what gets it complicated is that because of the image of Hawaii and the way that Hawaii is presented in the rest of the Pacific, both in Polynesia and Micronesia, Hawaii is sort of seen as the place where if you want something or you need something, this is the place to come to. So if you want your kids to get a better education, you don't do that in Samoa, Tonga, or in some of them like Chuuk or someplace. You do that by sending them to Hawaii. If someone in the family needs medical assistance, then you send them to Hawaii. So Hawaii becomes the point of resolution for needs. And so what you get is then, of course, if you're sending someone who's ill over here, and then say someone from Tonga is coming up here because they've got, diabetes, so they've got to come up for dialysis treatment or something, then the family who's already up here, who's already sending money back to Tonga, is now also expected to care for that family member up here. And of course, at the same time, since they're not particularly well educated, they don't have a large skill set, that means that fairly traditionally they're going to be taking maybe working 3 jobs. So you've got someone who's maybe, a parent, they've got 2 kids, and they're home maybe for 4 hours a day if they're lucky. And they've got someone who's ill in the family they're supposed to take care of. So these folks are just, they're just up to here with stuff. And what that means, among other things, is they don't have the time or luxury of assimilating. There's just not enough days and hours in the day. So the reality is that these remittance economies do them absolutely no favors. They're hugely convenient if you're back in Samoa or Tonga, because basically it's sort of like getting a welfare recipient. You've got relatives in Hawaii, and of course later if you watch the video, relatives in places like California who are sending money back. So you basically become a consumer. What you've done is you've generated a family concept, that family is more important than the individual. To a certain extent, I don't get offended by this, but that becomes a way you can manipulate people to make sure that first and foremost they send money back home. Even if they have cash demands where they live, you're not going to let that take precedence, because you literally depend on their money. You've got food to survive on. These areas are still totally self-sufficient in terms of food production. But for anything else, you're basically dependent on your Hawaii relatives to subsidize you. Because you have to remember, there's basically no economy in the Samoas or in Tonga. Except for getting a civil service job in the governments. There's basically no industry. There's nothing out there. They've tried, but it's all failed miserably. So everyone depends on Hawaii money, or later, as we'll see, New Zealand money or California money. But what you end up is basically that becomes, the way it works. Now, the way this gets very weird is by the 1990s, what you find is the populations of Tonga in, say, New Zealand, and of course, certainly in Hawaii, but certainly in New Zealand, is actually more than the number of Tongans in Tonga. The number of American Samoans who are actually outside of American Samoa, in Hawaii, California, Washington, wherever, is larger than the number of American Samoans in American Samoa. And within 5 or 10 years, the number of Samoans in the country of Samoa, outside of Samoa, is going to be more than the number of Samoans in Samoa. And this is because of these remittance economies. If the family needs more money, you send another family member out, and that generates more revenue. So basically what you do is you ramp up production. And one of the side effects of this is this part of the Pacific has one of the highest birth rates in the world. They have a lot of kids, and those kids are then trained, and those kids are sent off to Aotearoa, to us, to California, or whatever, because that's how the folks in the home territory survive. This is a very, very different model than everyone else. Sure, you've got Filipinos here sending money back home, but you've got Filipinos in Hong Kong, you've got Filipinos all over the world sending money back home. And you've also got a production base in the Philippines. So, it's part of their economic system, but it's not the entire one. In Central Polynesia and in Micronesia also, the only economic system is relatives sending money back. And this becomes a real complicated scenario when the majority of your population is overseas. And at that point, you end up in a very paradoxical situation, which now you should be watching that video, which is one of the reasons I asked you to do the reaction questions. Because in that case, since Samoa was the most visible of these, both here and also, in places like California, and also just because of the Samoan society has been very vocal in terms of actually putting explicit terms to this. What you find is you end up with this paradox of the idea of culture on one hand and ethnicity on the other. So if you're Samoan in Samoa, you're part of Samoan culture. Well, there's very few outsiders, relatively speaking, percentage-wise in Samoa, both in Samoa and American Samoa. There's very few outsiders in Tonga either. Almost everyone in Tonga is Tongan. So you don't have a large population of people other than you. So what this means, among other things, you have a population that, even though they're aware of the outside world, have never really had to adjust attitudes and values to put up with folks in the outside world. Those folks are basically outsiders who are temporarily in their country in one way, shape, or form. So on one hand, you have this idea of culture being a constant. On the other hand, if you remember what I mentioned at the start, you've had European contact for 200 or 300 years. The Europeans brought in Christianity, wiped out your traditional religions, have modified the social system, fossilized it in terms of putting chiefs who were leaders, temporary leaders, basically in permanent charge, changing people from chiefs to kings. So they've entirely changed large parts of the social political system, and certainly changed the religious system completely out of all reckoning. And yet that becomes the new idea of traditional culture. So if you talk to someone from Samoa or Tonga, they see traditional culture and Christianity, for example, as being the same thing. But hopefully by now in this class you've realized that can't possibly be, because Christianity was not part of traditional Samoan or Tongan culture. It's a part of the European import. It's part of colonialism. And yet what you get is this very strong attitude that Samoa or Tonga is the culture. And it becomes actually almost a physical entity. And what that means is Samoans or Tongans up here are not in culture anymore, because now they're a minority in a place that's very diverse. And the more they assimilate or adapt to life up here, the more they're moving away from that culture norm that is the base back home where they're sending the money to. And that's the basis of that tension when you watch that fires burning video. That's the difference between folks in a culture arguing that it's always been the same when it obviously hasn't. And then saying that folks in other places aren't being like the gang guys in LA. Oh, they're not real Samoans. Samoans don't do that. Well, whatever. But the thing is those guys are actually part of an ethnic group in California. But as some of them point out in the interviews when you watch it, they point out going back to Samoa means at that point they sort of change from being ethnic, they're suddenly re-embedded in the culture. And they're actually forced assimilated back into what is seen as this base culture package. And so this issue of culture and ethnic, it's true of all the groups here, but it's probably most striking for the Samoans and Tongans for the very simple reason that one of the large aspects of this idea of culture in both Samoa and Tongan is the absolute dominance of family and respect for authority, which means that if the head of the family, the Matai, in your Samoan family says, we need you to send money back home because so-and-so is, got into trouble and we have to do a love for him. And so we've got to give this gifts and we don't have any money back here. So we need you to send money back for this special ceremony. You don't have a choice. One of my office mates when I was in the master's program at UH is from Samoa, not American Samoa, from Samoa. And twice he had to send cars. He had to buy cars in Hawaii and send them down to Samoa. I have no idea how much that cost, but it cost a fortune. Because the head of his family said, we need a car. They could have bought one in Samoa, but because he was in Hawaii, and even though he was a grad student, of course, made no money, in their view, he had access to resources, so it was his job, his obligation to family to do so. And the second time around, he was, all bent out of shape because he was either going to be able to pay his tuition at UH or send the car back. And basically the family said, if you're disloyal to the family, then don't ever talk to us again. So he dropped out for a semester, got the money together, and sent the car down to the family. There was no interest in his situation here. He was an individual. The family's more important, but of course, in both these cases, it wasn't the family as an entity. It's the head of family that wanted the car. And he later found out that it was actually given away to a competing family as part of a ceremony because someone in his family got into a fight at school with someone else. So it wasn't like the family was using it. The family wanted it as a gift. But what they're also showing is the power that they had over family members outside of Samoa, that they could make family give stuff because our family follows the rules. Our family obeys what the head of family says. He was, I haven't seen him about 10 years, but that's still something. You don't want to bring that up unless you want to listen to him for about an hour. But ironically, he's an anthropologist. I mean, he knows exactly how it works, but he's part of that group. And that's the way it works in that group. And that's how it's seen. So this particular concept of the idea of culture as a very definable package is usually called Fa Samoa. Fa Samoa is a very complex term, like Hawaiian. It's a very kauna term. It has a lot of meanings. One of the main ideas is the idea that there's a proper normative way to do something. And if you're going to be truly Samoan and be a part of the family, you do it in the Fa Samoa way. And what's happened is in the last 100 years, especially with remittance economies becoming big, is the Fa Samoa thing has become, in many ways, gotten sort of smaller. So the options that are available if you're up here to do the Samoan, do it the right way, have become ever less, which is actually, in a rather cynical way, is terribly convenient for the folks down in Samoa, because anytime someone up here says, oh, I can't, I've got to put the kids in school, I've got to do this, or I've got to do that, then you can invoke Fa Samoa and say, well, we don't care what your problems are, the family needs your support. And because you're part of this family, if you want to remain a part of this family, this is the way we do it. And this becomes a big, pry bar to basically move people around. And what this does, of course, is all this means there's a constant interface, of course, or interaction between the folks down there and the folks up here, which means, again, it's much more difficult if you're Samoan or Tongan to find the time and just the mental distance to actually adjust and adapt to life with the people you're living around, because you've got so much pressure on you to constantly support and provide for family back home, if you would. And this stress is a huge part of the stress that defines sort of Tongan Samoan societies, or I should say Tongan Samoan members here in Hawaii, is that relationship. Of course, part of that is theoretically the folks up here could invoke Fa Samoa and the folks down in Samoa and say, well, if we're family, you can't take advantage of us all the time. We've got kids up here, we've got part of the families up here, we need these resources up here, and theoretically they could do that. But the hierarchical way that Samoan society and Tongan society even more so is turned into in the 19th, 20th century, because ironically of European, sort of colonialism, has meant that it's very much a one-way street. So this whole issue of remittance economies really is absolutely central to understanding the problems and the situation that Samoans and Tongans find themselves in Hawaii in the 20th and 21st century. It pretty much drives how they have to view everything. And if you think about it, it's a huge part of what's in that video, because the older generation, the parents of the gangers in LA, they're sending money back home. And let's see, I don't know if I'm going to get that next time or not. I might as well hop over that. What you find is there's sort of two paradoxical aspects of this. One is that if I'm sent up here from Tonga, So I'm a teenager, I come up here, I go to school, I get a job, so I'm making money, I'm sending it back home. We'll say that I get married to a Tongan lady here, and so we have kids. Now, she and I are both going to send money back home because we're parts of our families, and that's what we're obligated and expected to do. Now, our kids grow up, we'll say that we live in, I don't know, we live in Makiki or something like that. So the kids are growing up, the kids go to McKinley High School, or Kaimuki, I don't know, McKinley High School. So the kids go to McKinley High School. So they're going up with their local kids. On one hand, they're Tongan. So if this was like 20, 30 years ago, they're going to be stereotyped against. But on the other hand, they're still considered part of the system here. They were born here. So in that situation, when they're growing up, we'll say that they're now your guys' age, they're now in their teens, 20s. And my wife and I are both telling them, and the family's telling us, that now that they're in their 20s, they should get jobs and they should be helping the family by sending money back home to their relatives, especially their aunties and uncles and their grandparents, and they had a family to show respect for the family. Now, on one hand, my wife and I will buy into that because that's what we grew up with. On the other hand, our kids very much see themselves as part of a local lifestyle. They have the same wants and desires, and they want to buy the same things. They want to look like their friends. They want to be able to have the stuff their friends have. And in that context, they're going to get really unhappy if every time they want something, they're told, no, we've got to send money back home. Because in their case, it's very likely they've only visited home maybe once in their entire life, if at all. And they occasionally see relatives up here. But their concept of family is very abstract compared to the friends and the people they grew up with in their neighborhood and their schools. So when they become adults, it's going to be much more difficult for the family back in Tonga to hit them up for cash all the time. And if they say, oh, you got to buy a car and send it back home, I can almost guarantee them the kids are going to go, I don't think so. So in that situation, the only way that the family in Tonga is going to be able to keep money rolling in as my wife and I get older, and especially if we suddenly point out that, we need to buy a house or something here, the kids, got to go to school and stuff. So, at some point, the amount of money we're sending back might actually shrink because of our actual, just realistic needs here. And what that means is the next generation is going to send that money back home. Or if they do, they're going to send just like token amounts. They're not going to send, 20 to 40% of your paycheck, which is what a lot of Samoans and Tongans here do to back home. They're not going to commit to that same level. And at that point, if the Tongan family is going to have money coming in, they're going to have to send out a new group of Tongans from Tonga, in other words, our relatives, to New Zealand, to Hawaii, to wherever, to basically generate that replacement income because our income's disappearing. So what you get is this constant vetting out of new members of the family to keep this resource base up. And of course, if the family really wants even more money, then you send even more members out. But what happens then is very quickly within, say, 2 generations, you move from being part of a culture to being ethnic. So whereas my wife and I would be Tongan, would be part of the culture, and we will have assimilated to Hawaii in large part, the kids would probably have to be defined as ethnic Tongan because they grew up here, they speak Pidgin as their normal language. I'm sure they understand Tongan when we yell at them or something like that, but it's a very good chance they don't speak Tongan very well, if at all, back to us. It was very typical second generation. It's certainly true of my in-laws who are Cantonese. The second generation, your guys' age group, none of them speak Cantonese. They can understand it, because otherwise your parents are going to whack you. And they can watch, soap operas and stuff, but they never use it. And they oftentimes joke about it because they're born here. They're local English / Pidgin speakers. Cantonese is a foreign language to them they grew up with. And in fact, it's sort of a shame. One of the ironies was at least 2 of them actually took Chinese in school, and in both cases almost failed the class because they didn't know how to speak Chinese. They never had to do it and weren't interested in it. They just thought they could skate by the class. So the second generation very frequently is going to be ethnic. And of course, their kids, my grandkids, are not going to be culturally Tongan pretty much at all, unless for some reason we send them back to Tonga to be sort of reacculturated. So that becomes one of the key aspects is there's a constant, what you might call revenue decline, as populations become more assimilated and the reality of life in Hawaii or, life in California or life in Auckland or wherever it is, becomes more and more demanding as you set up family, you've got more relatives over here. So the demands of family, which never end. But of course, if I'm now in my 60s and I left Tonga when I was 16, and I've gone back and visited a couple of times, of course I know people. On the other hand, my wife and my family and my friends and my relatives here are going to be much closer to me because I interact with them all the time. So more and more sending large amounts of money back home, sending a large chunk, 20 to 30, 40% of my paycheck back to Tonga is going to become really irritating because there's all sorts of things the family really needs. If I'm going to raise a family well, I can't afford to send 40% of what I make back home. And in many cases, what you're going to find is that the generation that, you know, if I was Tongan, I'd be a part of, they really don't even know their family because they're working 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. So, you know, they suddenly get in their 60s and they realize they barely recognize their kids and their kids barely recognize them. And they send all this money back home and it just vanishes. There's nothing, anything coming back. It's all you owe the family because of this value system. And you know, that's really hard to keep up for enormously long periods of time. Because one of the things you don't see that you do see with Filipinos, you do not see a lot of circular migration. You do not see a lot of Samoans or Tongans go back to Samoa or Tonga and then come back to Hawaii. The folks, and the reason very simply is if they go back to Samoa or Tonga, they're not generating revenue. So the family sort of wants them to stay here and make money and send the money back instead. You know, it sounds rather crass, but you know, sort of the functional reality of life in the 20th century and 21st century runs on money. Life in the Central Pacific is the same as life here. So, you know, these populations have very different parameters they're operating under simply because the world has changed. Now, if you get in the last 30 years, then it becomes even more complicated because then you get into internet, social media, and of course, the last decade or so, Facebook, all the stuff like that. Now, family can basically be on top of you 24/7, 365, even though you haven't seen them in 10 or 15 years. So one of the side effects is what you get is the demands for resources from the Hawaii delegation goes up. It's not lessened by having more contact. It even goes up more. And one of the weird side effects of this, and this is very true, at least to Samoans, I'm not sure what Tongans are, I don't see why it wouldn't be, is you end up with a little bit of what was sort of happening with the Korean guys back in the turn of the 20th century. So if I actually send pictures back home with, you know, sort of, you know, goofy place that I'm running in Makiki, and there's me and the wife and 2 kids in a small place, and I show them what little we've got, and I send it back to Tonga, what you're going to find is a fair amount of the family on one hand will actually understand that this is true, but a fair amount of the family on the other hand will actually think that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to hide how much we're actually making. So like their Korean counterparts of over 100 years ago, they're actually going to take the sort of, you know, folklore that Hawaii is full of money and jobs and resources, and they're going to believe that more than they believe what I'm actually telling them as a family member. This is a huge source of friction for family members up here when they actually complain to family in Samoa or Tonga that they're doing everything they can. And what you'll find is a fair amount of the family back in the home areas will say, well, yeah, but, you know, we look on TV and we watch Hawaii Five-0 and everyone's driving the nice cars, everyone's got all this neat shit and you know, da-da-da-da-da, and we don't have any of that stuff. So you've obviously got that stuff, but you're trying to pretend you don't have it because you want to limit the amount of money you send to us. And this is a huge source of frustration for the families up here. So the combination of the lack of labor vacuum, which means it's very hard to find work that pays well, the differential rate of assimilation because you just don't have the time, and you're going to take chump low-end paying jobs and as many as you can get because you desperately need to send money back to the home area. Plus, you've got to raise a family here in most cases. Because again, these folks aren't coming over as single males. These folks are coming over as family units. You know, so it just makes life really, really, really difficult for them. But it's a very different type of difficulties. It's not better or worse than, say, someone who's Japanese coming over in 1878. But it's totally different than what the Japanese dealt with in 1878. So these populations, we'll finish up with this next time, these populations have a very, very different set of parameters are operating under. And one thing that's I've never seen a particular amount of work is there's a really good work done by I guess in the Pacific Island class. Where did it go? I can't find it right now. It's on basically a Tongan society in the 21st century. It's a really fascinating look at life in Tonga Tapu with particular groups. And one of the things that comes out of that that's really sort of striking is even in the 21st century, in the world that we live in now, with global media and everything, the persistence of stereotypes about Hawaii and, in their case, New Zealand, versus what they've got at home is really sort of striking because you sort of wonder, well, you know, why don't they understand the reality of what's being portrayed? It's one of the interesting aspects of human nature. Okay, let's stop there because that's enough to keep you guys out of trouble for a day, I think. Oops. What happened there? Any questions, comments, anything? It's the last full week of class, and I think everyone's just sort of like trying to survive, right?